What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Gore podcast. We are with Mr. George Boreas once again. George, how's it been?
Great, and great to be back, Parks.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's been a long time since we had an episode with George. I think the last one we covered was Sophocles. Today we're going to be covering Christ the Eternal Tao. We're also going to be talking a little bit about Taoism, how it compares to Christianity, and this text by Hieromonk Damascene.
Awesome.
So George, can you kind of tell us what your personal, experience with this topic is, with the Tao and with also the Christ the Eternal Tao right here?
Right. I read the book a couple of months ago, but I should start probably quite a few years back, 2008. Okay, so way back in another life. It was the first time when I came to Asia to teach English, passport bro here, I guess. At the time, I went to South Korea, and I wasn't an Orientalist. I wasn't necessarily in love with Eastern cultures like a lot of expats are. But I was already getting spiritual at the time. It was actually my first time I was getting very into Christianity. So I got to East Asia and I got these books. I got Tao Te Ching and Hagakure, which is the Japanese samurai book. And I remember very early on when I read Tao Te Ching, which is kind of like a poetry, obscure poetry, reads a little bit like that. But I remember being struck how it's kind of Christian-like. I mean, I'm not going to take the credit that I made a connection, certainly not in an amazing sense in which Father Damascene did. But, they're just these lines that kind of, that strike you, about, what would it be? You might have some quotes too, but how the Tao is kind of gentle, how it's unpresuming, how it's the origin of all things, how it's about non-strife, how it avoids high places and so on. So in spirit, it was very kind of gentle. And I carried that thought. I also thought, and I looked at a new version of Tao Te Ching, which I reread yesterday. I thought there was a line about it saying how somebody with a great sign or a great symbol is going to show up and unite people. But that might have been lost in translation. But I remember that one line struck me as like, oh, man, he might be talking about this, a sign of Christ. I mean, not explicitly, of course, but it might be a prophecy. So I did carry it with me the whole time. Hagakure, the Book of Samurai, which I also took a peek through, is a little bit of a different vibe. I think you could criticize it because it's got a bit of a, I don't want to say death. It's not death worshipping, but it is kind of like resignation unto death, which could be, I guess, interpreted in some somewhat ascetic way. But I think it goes a little too far. But Hagakure also has got lines where it's like a true samurai should avoid seeking honor and respectability. And especially as a younger guy, that struck me as, first of all, counterintuitive. I mean, if you're not, as a soldier, if you're not seeking respectability and honor, what are you seeking? But it feels like only a Christian book would have that kind of sentiment. I mean, maybe I was naive, but it did strike me as kind of radically self-effacing, which I, at the time at least, could only find in these kind of Eastern texts and Christianity. And then, to do my historical arc, I met Father Hieromonk Damascene in St. Herman of Alaska Monastery in Platinum, California last summer. I can talk more at length about that, but my friend Charlie, who had read the book then, and they have copies, he asked some questions about it. And Father Damascene was very nice and kind of elaborating on some of those topics. But after that visit, I also read the book, and I realized how it's like kind of next level interpretation. And I'm like, wow, I had no idea how actually deep connection is, because as you know, this book was written. There's a history in it where Father Damascene and Father Seraphim Rose, right? They actually studied Oriental philosophy under a Chinese scholar in San Francisco area, so they got actually in-depth scholastic exposure to this and have authoritative sources that made them appreciate the depth of the text itself, but also the depth of its parallels with the Christian revelation.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I actually had no idea that you had met Father Damascene. That's actually very interesting. I want to hear more about that. But so like where I'm coming at this text from, I don't know if me and you have ever gone over my personal history with the text, but so like I picked this up whenever I was maybe 19 years old in college. And I was pretty much just like a pothead and was kind of disenchanted with my Protestant upbringing. Not that I was like, anti-Christian or anything like that. I always thought of myself as a Christian, but I was looking for something exotic. You get into college, you start looking at all these exotic kind of Eastern spirituality things. And Buddhism was a little bit too far out there for me. Some of the other Eastern spiritualities were a bit too far out there for me. But the Tao, or the Tao, as a lot of people like to pronounce it, it was close enough for me to my sort of understanding of like the Christian ethic that I was sort of comfortable diving into it, looking into it. And I was very shocked to find a lot of what you were mentioning there, which is that it does seem to have a very kind of a Christian ethic. And then there's also these super shocking lines. I was just flipping through it at random. You can pretty much flip through this book at random, and every single chapter has something that sort of resonates as Christian and theological. Here's one, for example. It's speaking of sort of the nature of the Tao, which the Tao itself is by nature ineffable. It's something that cannot be fully explained, understood. A lot of it is beyond words. That's one of the core tenets of Taoism itself. But it says that the three ultimately cannot be fathomed. Therefore, they join to become the one. So there's this sense in Taoism in which the Tao is one, but it's also three. And the one, it gives rise to the three. And then the three is said to give rise to the 10,000 things, which is just a poetical way of saying everything. The three gives rise to everything. Sure. And so we do see this kind of interplay between unity, between multiplicity. But one of the distinguishing features of the Tao, we can get into some of this later, is that it's impersonal. Right, which is super different than what we as Christians would say. God is obviously personal, and so. But I just wanted to give some of my background on coming to this text because, I was a pot smoking kid in college. I was like, oh man, this says non-action. Yeah, that sounds cool. I feel like I'm practicing that when I'm like vegging out on my couch or whatever. You know what I mean? So, there was a lot of lines here that I underlined, whenever I was 19. And it kind of gives me an insight into what I was thinking whenever I was reading it. But also, a lot of it is things that you could say resonate with a sort of a Christian ethic or a Christian metaphysic. I'm trying to find some examples here. The Tao is so vast that when you use it, something is always left. Let's see. The highest goodness is like water. Water easily benefits all things without struggle. And another thing, too, is that it talks about how water naturally flows down to the lowest place. And it also takes the form of whatever container it's in. And in the Bible, there's this image of the dew that falls upon the fleece, and this is supposed to be an image of God sort of condescending to man. And so what we have in the Tao is essentially an attempt to capture what ultimately is inexplicable. And Lao Tzu was obviously someone who was writing this before Christ became incarnate. But we would say, and I think the general thrust of Christ the Eternal Tao that we'll be getting into here is that Lao Tzu was sort of capturing as much as a person could know about the true like metaphysics of reality and theology that is finally revealed and explicated in Christian revelation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and Father Damascene mentions that it's almost to his credit. It is to his credit that Lao Tzu says it's ineffable, or he just says in first person, it's like, I don't know its name. He's being honest, right? And he is conscious that there's something out there that hasn't been revealed to him. So, and again, in the book, I think Christ the Eternal Tao, it says like this is the farthest that human intuition went on its own in comprehending sort of the nature of God. So he's kind of like the champion, right, of going the farthest in terms of sensing the true nature of God, because comparing him to the prophets and Christian saints later, they had a revelation, right? Whereas Lao Tzu kind of just went on his own. So that's really impressive, I think, and makes you think for sure.
Right. And so one thing that I would say Higher Monk Damascene is sort of at pains to outline in the beginning of this book is that what we're dealing with here is a text of comparative theology. We are not saying that Taoism and Christianity are essentially the same, because there are, as we stated earlier, some pretty distinct differences. Number one being that the Tao is something impersonal, whereas we would say that the Logos is the second person of the Godhead. But it's a big point here in the beginning to essentially say what we're doing is not syncretism. We're not trying to say that you can be a Christian and a Taoist. What we're saying is Taoists, in their expression of the Tao, in their understanding of the Tao, we're getting as close to an understanding of the Logos as human beings could get. And essentially what they're doing is a sort of natural theology. We have this concept of natural theology. It's been very much popularized by Roman Catholicism here in the West, this idea that through philosophy, through reason, through observation of the world, we can come to some sort of knowledge about metaphysical things, about God, about theology. And whereas I would say the West and Roman Catholics would maybe go more into the cataphatic form of natural theology, trying to make positive statements about who God is, what the nature of reality is. Taoism is, I would say, a lot more like Eastern Orthodox theology in that it's very apophatic. We're not going to try to make positive statements about what God is, in his essence. We're not going to try to make positive statements about what the Tao is in its essence. We're going to sort of say things that it's not, and we're going to kind of work around it without trying to make any positive claims, because we're talking about things that are ultimately transcendent and things that are beyond our reasoning, beyond our explanation. And so I think the mode of theologizing that happens in the Tao is, I think it's a sort of natural theology, but it's a natural theology proper. It's more epistemically humble, in my view, and that was something that I really appreciated while I was reading it.
Yeah, it's apopathic natural philosophy, I would say. So, in the West, if you look at the Greek philosophers, right, they also had natural philosophy. You have Socrates, Plato proofs of God's existence. I'm a fan of that too. Kind of using logic to argue, for example, the first unmoved mover, right? Everything in the natural world is caused by something else. Therefore, the chain of causation can be infinite. There's got to be something that started a whole chain. That would be natural philosophy that's, I don't know what the correct term for it would be, but it's certainly using kind of logic to argue for the existence of God. When you look at Lao Tzu, there's this kind of intuitive aspect to it. And maybe calling it intuitive is not fair, but there's no what's called like dialectic, like A equals A is B, this kind of classic logic thing. There might be a little bit, but there's kind of this intuition and imagery. Yes, when you compare Catholic and Orthodox, let's say mysticism or monasticism specifically, I think it's safe to say that the Catholics learn more towards the logical, influenced by Aristotle, whereas Orthodox monks would sometimes get accused by Western Christians of quietism, Okay, so quietism is kind of like the English transliteration of the word hesychasm, which in Greek I think just means quiet. So it's this contemplative silent mode that arrives at these visions. And yeah, Lao Tzu is more adjacent to the quiet hesychastic tradition than he would be to the Aristotelian tradition of natural philosophy. And I think that creates a certain vibe match, right, between the orthodox monasticism and Lao Tzu. And I don't know anything about Taoism as an institutional religion. I haven't looked it up. I actually don't know what their tenets are. But Lao Tzu himself, if you just take him for face value, is definitely got that very appealing, kind of familiar sounding vibe to a lot of us Orthodox Christians, maybe, well, anybody really.
Definitely. And you mentioned institutional Taoism, and so I kind of actually wanted to ask you this question because I was working at an airport a long time ago, and it was shortly after I read the Tao, and I had this friend there who was an expat from China. He was a younger guy. He was about my age. And I told him, I said, yeah, the Tao, I've read the Tao. That's, do you know anything about it? I know you're from, China and stuff. And he said, oh, no. Like, he's like, don't read that book. And I was like, why? What's wrong? What's wrong with the Tao? He goes, if you read that book, it will make you strange. And that's all that he said. And he wasn't, like, his English was sort of limited at the time. And so I didn't really understand what he meant. But then later on in that same conversation, me and him sort of got on the topic of Christianity and stuff. And he said, Christians are very judgmental, and all of man's problems will eventually be solved by science one day. So he was coming from a very particular worldview. But I don't know, George, as far as Taoism in practice, as far as I know, it's not super popular in practice nowadays. I think it's like something like maybe like 1% of the population of China still practices, or?
Yeah, so I'm not sure, and it's hard to find stats, so I can speak from kind of just casual, my life here in Shanghai, right? I live in a district that's kind of at the heart of old Shanghai, and it's got a very famous temple called Jing'an Temple. I believe that's the Buddhist temple, and it's actually got a lot of monks in it. But it's surrounded by like shopping district. It's like right in the heart of the downtown. And then just north of me, there's another Jade Buddha temple. I guess these are Buddhist temples. They're open, they're functioning, and you'll see a lot of Chinese people with prayer beads or something like that. I don't ask them about it. So I think in China right now, there's no kind of government. It's certainly not promoted by the government, but I think it's also not persecuted by the government, these things. And just like, I'm from Eastern Europe, there's this kind of a range of religiosity where, like, at one extreme, you're really into it, you know what I mean? And then on another extreme, you're just doing it because it's your tradition. Right. So you see a lot of people with these prayer beads or Chinese traditional things that were associated with spirituality, but there might not necessarily be kind of, regular going temple going Buddhists. They might just be doing it as a kind of like a cultural thing. But when you told me the story about your friend, there is a organization. I don't know if it's Taoist, but I think it's called Falun Gong, something like that. Have you heard of them?
Yes.
This thing is, I'm almost kind of worried of saying it. I guess we're on the Western internet, but it's almost taboo to mention it. But it's certainly considered by Chinese government as a subversive and harmful cult. Okay, it's illegal, and it's considered something like Scientology. You know what I mean? That like an average American would consider something like Scientology, or maybe extremes of Mormonism or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's how your typical Chinese would think of that. And then you go to Canada or Western countries, and these guys would have demonstrations, human rights demonstrations, right, and how they're being persecuted by the communist government. I don't know what side I'm on. I don't even want to research it. But yeah, like, so when your friend said that, my guess would be like, it's like you're asking him about Scientology. because it's like
Right.
he thinks of Taoism as like this kind of extreme Scientology, like weird cult, and that's
Right.
what he meant when he said you're going to become weird. You're going to become like a Scientologist or something.
Right. And I almost sort of thought about it as, I'm a religious person in the United States who is Christian, who is interested in Taoism, because I see in Taoism, I keep saying Taoism or Taoism. I know it's better to pronounce it as Taoism, but I see in this other religion that's very far away something that resonates and something that I recognize in my own religion, and that I feel like my religion expresses in a even more sort of full sense. And so I am fond of it for certain reasons, the same reasons that I would say Hiram Monk Damascene and Seraphim Rose were fond of it. But from maybe his viewpoint, my friend, he's sort of working on a scientism sort of framework where anything religious is bad, or anything religious is scary or weird. On the topic of the Falun Gong, you know that we actually have Falun Gong here in Texas?
I'm not surprised. I just don't know how much I think they're everywhere. Just I don't know if you ever talked to them or something. So
I've never spoken to them, but so there's a dance company here in Texas called Shin Yun, and there's all these posters for it everywhere, billboards for it. You see it all over Houston, and it's this dance company. And they put on these big elaborate shows. No one I know has ever been to a Shin Yun concert. However, you see these billboards everywhere. They clearly have a ton of funding, and their ticket prices are insane. The ticket prices are more than freaking if I don't know the Beatles were to resurrect and come to town. It's crazy. But anyways, yeah, I think that was totally off topic, but I just wanted to tell you about that. Okay, but so in speaking of the Tao, so I want to sort of get into what the Tao is, how it relates to our concept of the Logos, explain to people kind of what the Logos is, and then just kind of talk about how they compare and contrast. Because in the Taoist understanding, they would sort of say that the Tao is the principle of order behind all things. It gives rise to all things. It is an impersonal force, but the goal of Taoism is to bring your will in alignment with, or to conform with, the will of the Tao. And so to me, that sort of very much resonates with our sort of concept of the Logos, because the Logos in our theology it's the second person of the Godhead, who is Christ, who is a person, who shares the will of the Father, and who we are supposed to conform to the image of. And Logos was a term that, it came out of Greek philosophy. It had different understandings and sort of evolved over time in Greek philosophy. But we would say, I think, that this idea of the Logos, this concept of the Logos, was not fully realized or fully revealed until Christianity came along, Christ incarnated, and then imparted his teaching to his disciples. In John 1, the gospel, it begins by talking about the Word of God. The Word of God, was with God in the beginning, and it was God, and all things were made through the Word. This Word of God is Logos in Greek, and there have been people who have translated that as Tao. The Tao was, with God in the beginning. All things that were made through the Tao. And so there is sort of this sense in which we would say that what they say about the Tao, we would also say about the Logos. There are some slight differences, but we would maybe attribute that to the fact that they're working from a natural apophatic theology, and we're working with something that was revealed through the Christian tradition. And so I don't know if you kind of have anything you want to bounce off of that, or if that brought up anything for you. But
yeah, it did. This is I just had an interview with E. Michael Jones, and he mentions Logos all the time, right? And even in the interview, he mentioned it. Of course, he wrote a book called Jewish Evolutionary Spirit, where he thinks the Jews are rebelling against the Logos. Not to get into that, but I asked him, I'm like, are you talking about Christian Logos or just Logos? And in his typical fashion, he's like, no, Logos, every Logos, the ordering principle of the universe. So, and he's very well read and educated, and that's really what it is. Every culture, most cultures, well, like philosophy in general has this idea of the ordering principle of the universe, kind of like reason, the right way. There's just, you look at the nature, you look at the cosmos, the sky, stars, and you get a sense that there's an orderliness to it. It's not haphazard. It's not chaotic, right? There's chaos too in human experience. That's when things fall apart. You have war and a sacrificial crisis. So the opposite of that is logos, meaning order. I was just kind of Googling stuff, researching stuff, and there was a quote came up from Saint Justin Martyr, Eastern Church father. He discussed logos, and I don't know the details of it, but of course, a lot of these church fathers knew about logos and the connection, and what is the connection between the ancient Greeks and Christians. And he said that, St. Justin Martyr, that, people who lived in accordance to their understanding of logos, even before Christ, were in some sense Christians. So again, we're not overstepping boundaries here. This is a church father. Of course, it's different, and we're blessed and incredibly lucky to meet what we believe or are convinced is Logos as a person and Savior. And it's incredibly comforting and fills us with hope that Logos is not an abstract concept, robot matrix, right? So we're blessed for that, and I feel compassion for people who weren't aware for that back in the day. It's an amazement that they even got that close, and I hope that they, in the other life, the next life, they got to meet the person. But anyway, to get back a little bit to the philosophy, we kind of discussed this Lao Tzu logos, right? We know, of course, Johannine logos of John. René Girard, I discussed this. Girard wrote a big article, and he also talked about logos. And in Girard's writing, he tries to kind of rescue or defend logos from the new kind of existentialist postmodernist philosophers, specifically Nietzsche and Heidegger. Okay, so to tell you that little angle, we have the very famous opening of St. John's Gospel. At the beginning was the Word was with God, Word was God. And everybody throughout ages knew that this was kind of bringing in of a Greek philosophical concept into Christianity, kind of baptizing the logos, as they might say in Orthodox Church. But then in these kind of like new modern existentialist philosophers, or whatever you want to call them, the guys in the vein of Nietzsche, anti-Christian, right? They started this project where they were like, we want our pagan logos back. Okay, so I think Heidegger specifically, and Nietzsche too, they were saying that this wonderful pagan concept of logos, of the principle that makes opposites clash and gives birth to new ideas, this kind of deep philosophical existential concept was appropriated by these, Christians, Judeo-Christians, and turned into something much worse. Specifically, Heidegger would have thought of Johannine logos as kind of like the command and control logos. Heidegger didn't really understand Christianity. He thought of he was a member of the Nazi party for a while, and he kind of just thought of Christianity kind of like Nietzsche as like a variation of being a Jew, in a subversive Jew, right? So Christianity is subversive. So they would look down on the 10 commandments. So Heidegger, from my reading at least, Heidegger would say, look at the 10 commandments. There's no debate here. There's no philosophy. It's just this kind of tyrannical God saying, do this, do that, do this. Otherwise, you're going to hell, or something like that. So Heidegger is saying this is kind of the dumb tyrannical logos, and we want to rescue the logos of ancient Greece, which is much more vitalist and warrior-like. So Girard counters that. First of all, it's not clear that Heraclitus. So Heraclitus is the ancient Greek philosopher who lived. He was a contemporary with Lao Tzu. He has this. There's these thing called fragments. So these like survival writings from Heraclitus. Whatever he wrote, even if he wrote much, didn't survive. So there's literally just pieces of his sayings. They're like aphorisms, right? I don't know how many of them, but he mentions logos in like fragment 1. Heraclitus does, and it sounds very similar to Lao Tzu. Like don't listen to me, listen to logos. So this kind of idea of logos traces its roots to Heraclitus's fragments, but there's not much in Heraclitus that suggests that Heraclitus would have agreed with Heidegger or Nietzsche. But I think Girard does quote one fragment where it kind of does suggest to his theory, right? His theory is the theory of the sacrificial victim. So this kind of popular thing, philosophical thing of clash of the opposites, producing new things. That's also Hegel, historical dialectic, this idea that two things clash and produce a new form. Girard traces that to the sacrificial mechanism, right? There's a struggle, sacrificial crisis, and the only way to resolve it is by creating a sacred victim. Then that sacred victim becomes the embodiment of the new order, which is the logos. So to Girard, of course, to me, to us Christians, the Christian logos is actually the overcoming of that old violent sacred, of constant clashing, of blood, like violent logos, to a logos that is actually a lot like Lao Tzu's, non-violent, right, self-effacing kind of thing. So this historical debate, philosophical historical debate about logos and what it produces, it's very fascinating, right? So, for example, to give you even more depth here, Girard talks about Heidegger and Nietzsche. Even though they're both pro like violent logos, he says that Nietzsche realized that the violence is real. Nietzsche realized that that the difference between Dionysus, who's the representative of Greek logos, and Christ, they're opposite. And their opposition isn't just philosophical disagreement. It's actually, it bears consequences on the society and the world we live in. Like if you subscribe to this Dionysiac logos, you're going to end up having a violent society. You're going to end up victimizing people, right? And then Heidegger sensed that, and he tried to wash away the violence. So Heidegger's whole philosophy wasn't admitting that there was like real violence, real sacrifice, real blood behind these concepts, but that it was all just a matter of kind of intellectual debate and stuff like that. But so Girard would say no. Actually, Nietzsche was right in as far that he sensed real violence behind this ancient logos or archaic pagan logos. It's just he took the wrong side, unfortunately, and that Heidegger trying to wash it off is kind of wishful thinking. And that's what actually after Heidegger, all these anthropologists did when they look at myths, these violent myths. All the myths are kind of violent. Somebody's getting their torn apart, and all this kind of weird stuff. And the modern anthropology following Heidegger would kind of say that, that's just symbolic of human thought process. So they kind of try to ignore the actual violence these stories are founded on. So anyways, to kind of circle back here, I'm a Girardian. So like we would argue that one thing Christianity reveals, it reveals the ugly violence behind this old type of order. And then when we compare it to Lao Tzu, another impressive thing about Lao Tzu is that violence actually isn't there. So Lao Tzu is different than Heraclitus in that sense. You don't get a vibe that he's living in some pagan, sacrificial, like society where there's these kind of warrior kings and tyrants. You get a sense that whatever China or whatever state of his time is kind of tranquil. You know what I mean? Chilling in the mountains, meditating. So that's another kind of pro to this, kind of credit to Lao Tzu's logos.
So you had mentioned, I'm glad you brought up Girard in this conversation, because number one, I feel like that was one of the main things I was sort of trying to draw out of you in this conversation, because I feel like you are very well read when it comes to Girard, and also it really tied in something that so in this copy I have here, like I said, I was reading this when I was 19. There was a bunch of things that I would underline and things that resonated with me at the time, and one of the ones that was really striking, and I actually think there's something Girardian here, is a line from the Tao. It says, "No matter how much you manipulate, you can never possess the world." So there is this concept in the Tao of, I don't want to say outright passivity, but it is the concept of wu wei, action through inaction, which is in a sense, it is a very Christian idea, because it's this idea of like, you all you can do is sort of submit yourself to the will of the logos, and sort of, you got to go with the flow in a certain sense. That doesn't mean be totally passive, don't ever do anything. But it's that you have to align your will with the way of being, which is the logos, which is the Tao. And in the case of, I think a Girardian view, big thing with Girard is the scapegoat mechanism. And a big part of the scapegoat mechanism is you want to get control of the narrative. You want to get control of who's going to end up getting scapegoated. That way, when the new social order is built on the body of the victim, so to speak, you can sort of benefit from this new social order. Except it is a very Christian idea that even if you are somehow to get away with the perfect crime, right? You're able to scapegoat. You're able to sit on the throne of this new social order. The blood of the victims cries out from the ground, is what the scriptures say. And in the case of the Tao, it says, no matter how much you manipulate, you can never possess the world. And so I think this is a very Christian idea. It's a sort of idea that there's no evil deed that goes unpunished. What God has made crooked, man cannot make straight. And there's a lot of verses that I think honestly resonate with the same idea. Like the scriptures, they say, consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider this. God has made the one as well as the other, so that people may not find out anything that will be after them. And also, again, scriptures say, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And then still again, we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. And again, as he came from his mother's womb, so shall he go again. Naked shall he return, and shall take nothing for his toil that he can carry in his hand. And finally, by the Logos himself, by the word of God himself, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so there's this sense in which you can do all this sort of vain striving, this vain toil. You can try to persecute your enemies, stay on top. But ultimately, you're going to be kicking against the pricks. You're going to be going against the way of things. You're going to be going up against the Tao, the Logos, and it's not going to turn out good for you. And so the ethic of the Tao and the ethic, I would say, of Christianity is very much like you have to submit yourself to the will of the Logos, and you have to conform to that will. And so and you can consider even the contrary of what would happen, if a person, by all of their conniving, should come into a position where they are able to, for the whole course of their earthly life, get away with it, right? They come into possession of everything they see. They're able to smite all of their enemies. They get away with the perfect lie and are able to scapegoat all the right people at all the right times. What then would be the state of that person? Well, in Christianity, we would say, as the scriptures say, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? So there's this sense in which, both in Christianity and in the Tao Te Ching, there's an inherent passing away in things. Like this world is passing away, but ultimately this Tao, this Logos, is something permanent, something eternal, something uncreated that you can sort of tap into. You can take part in, participate in, and that seems to be the goal of both of these practices. And I'm glad you did bring up Saint Justin Martyr. So there's a lot of different viewpoints that a few different church fathers have when it comes to Greek philosophy. It really, a lot of it depends on how much they were trying to define themselves and their self-identity against or within Greek philosophy. Because there's some church fathers, I think, like Tertullian, who's super Tertullian's not a church father per se. He ended up being a heretic, but he was very antagonistic toward Greek philosophy. But Saint Justin Martyr, I read his writings earlier this year.
All right.
And no, he's great. And I wanted to bring him up in this episode because he has this concept. He calls it the logos spermaticos. And essentially what he did, it's sort of commonplace to us now to say, oh yeah, of course, Greek philosophy, they were sort of pointing toward the logos. And Christ is the expectation of the nations. All of these nations before Christ came around, their wise men, their philosophers, their righteous sages, all were sort of looking toward Christ in some sense and sort of had their own pagan prophecies of Christ. Except that is taken for granted in our day because of people like St. Justin Martyr. Because St. Justin Martyr, in his, I believe it was, I forget if it's his first or second apology or dialogue with Trypho, but he outlines what he calls the Logos Spermaticos doctrine, which is essentially the doctrine that the seeds of the Logos exist everywhere at all times, because of course it's the ordering principle of the entire universe. It's what gave rise to all things, and as Paul says, the law of God is inscribed in people's hearts,
human hearts.
There's a sense in which all created things have this imprint of the Logos upon them, and so St. Justin Martyr, we definitely have to credit him for this concept, because essentially it allows us to sit in a position where we say, here's what is correct in the Tao, here's what resonates, and they are correct in these ways. They have these seeds of truth, but ultimately those seeds of truth are pointing back to and are ultimately the property of Christians as a result of our, having it revealed by Christ.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. Was it say fullness of time? Right? Where does it say in the Bible? But Christ came in the fullness of time. I think St. Paul, right? So there's definitely a sense of preparation for him. I think Greek philosophy is one, and a lot of other things point to that. So I mean, these things don't. I never thought that there's Christ and there's Christianity, right? That's one thing I would differentiate. It's not really, I mean, I don't own copyright. Like we, as a Christian church, does not own any copyrights to logos. So it's the Christ that reveals himself, and the fullness of Christ is revealed in the church. But that doesn't mean that the church or any other culture or the ancient Hebrews lived in a sealed vacuum compared to other cultures, right? In both ways. So there's always an exchange, and things, I think, trickle one way and the other, right? There is a mutual influence. So absolutely, I think there's a lot of stuff. I mean, you mentioned, line after line in Tao Te Ching has this kind of kenosis. I think you mentioned the word kenosis, right? Kind of self-emptying. And there's almost in every chapter, like you said, there's this idea of avoiding high places, right? One of my favorite lines is this idea that when the emperor or the ruler is effective, nobody's aware that he exists, right? So kind of reminds you of that, things like a good, what is it? Strong men create good times kind of thing, right? Yeah. And people kind of take stuff for granted. Just all kinds of stuff. There's also a line, just for the record, saying that, at least my translation, saying that even though the wu wei, right, the non-doing ends up accomplishing everything. So this sense that even though you're kind of emptying yourself, or you're avoiding, you're seeking the emptiness, by doing that, you somehow end up accomplishing everything. So it's not strictly some kind of resignated thing, sitting on your couch or smoking dope thing. I mean, that's definitely kind of like a tempting way to interpret it, maybe. But it has this idea of a light touch, right? Light touch, and getting things done in that way.
Definitely. And
Yeah,
so go ahead.
Go ahead. Not much. What was I going to say? Yeah. Also, I like the line with the funeral. Basically, this idea that there's images saying how like wearing nice clothes and carrying sharp swords, and just kind of ostentatious display sort of thing, or striving, is something that gets you in trouble, or that withers away quickly. I like the image of basically like a military victory procession being celebrated as a funeral. I thought that was cool. I actually didn't catch it the first time, but he talks about sitting on the right hand and left hand, and I think like if you sit on the left hand, that's mourning. That's a position of mourning, and right hand it's celebration, or maybe it's the other way around. But is this idea that when a general celebrates victory in war, he doesn't sit on the celebration side; he sits on the mourning side. So this idea that a military victory ought to be celebrated as a funeral, because you shouldn't be celebrating slaughter of human beings. So that's like super, like not civilized. You know what I mean? That's super kind of like, well, you want to call it Christian or whatever, but it's just like super nice.
Yeah.
So there's this really high level understanding of human passions. I mean, of course, there's also mention how you should get rid of passions. And it's just kind of it's culturally, philosophically, it's a very, very and very sophisticated little book.
Right. And I do want to sort of get into a conversation here about relativism, right? Because I think what was attractive to me about the Tao as a young man was that it did sort of. I was intrigued by the fact that it was exotic. It's a sort of different Eastern spirituality. There was nothing in it that was necessarily offensive to my Protestant Christian understandings, but also there was nothing in it that really impelled me to act and reform my behavior and repent, so to speak, because it is so kind of poetic in nature and apophatic, and it very much you could say it's not super prescriptive either. It's just sort of telling you the way things are. It's not going to tell you, you need to act in this way. It's not going to give you a 10 Commandments, so to speak. And so for me at that point of time, I did sort of get into this sort of nihilistic, relativist attitude, but I never fully committed to abandoning Christianity, because I felt like, well, I was always just way too afraid to do that. Except in the process of all of this, I never went full Taoist. I'm not really sure why. I mean, I don't even know what would be involved with that, to be honest, but I could easily see somebody reading this and saying, okay, George, Parks, you guys are both saying that the Tao, it resonates with Christianity, and Christianity is the way to go, but the Tao has a lot of these pieces here. Why not just like fully commit to the Tao, or why not kind of do both? I mean, why do we have to make this extreme claim that Christ is the eternal Tao? Because after all, the first line of the Tao, let me quote it exactly here. The first line of the Tao literally says that, the Tao that can be followed is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So wouldn't it be a mistake then to say that, Christ is the eternal Tao? Wouldn't that be an essential compromise, or a compromise of the essential aspects of the Tao, what makes it the Tao? And I think it's a fair question, right? Like, why don't we kind of stay in this relativist state? Because when we try to make a positive claim that Christ is that eternal Tao that can be named, then we are risking something by making a positive assertion. Damascene's text, I think there's one section of Damascene's text that I think was really, really telling. I wish I'd found it earlier as a young man. I remember being a young man right around the time that I was sort of reading the Tao, I was very melodramatic, right? And there was this phrase that I would repeat to myself quite often. And I would say, I fear that by the time my life is done, I will only have just learned to live it. What exactly I meant by that, I'm not sure. I think it's possible to intuit what I meant by it, but I wasn't fully committing to Christianity, with the fullness of my heart. I was kind of, dipping my toes in these other spiritualities. But Higher Monk Damascene, in his book, he actually has a rendering of, so there's these sections in the book where he's kind of trying to combine verses of the Tao and substituting certain parts for like first person pronouns or third person pronouns, speaking of the Tao as a he. And this one is just really telling. I want to get your thoughts on this, George. So he says, one who sees all ways as having equal truth will find his life not long enough to follow the way to the end. One cannot be simple and guileless, free of multiple deliberations. One will be as a person having many lovers, occupied with each, yet given wholly to none. One will not be married to the way, but will remain outside the bridal chamber.
Is this from Tao Te Ching?
This is, this is from Christ the Eternal Tao. This is one of... Yeah.
So it's like Father Damascene writing his own kind of...
Yes.
Okay, Christian kind of, yeah. Okay, what's your interpretation? Can you just...
Well, there's, to me, what I get from it is essentially that he's saying one who sees all ways as having equal truth will find his life not long enough to follow the way to the end. And so it's essentially this statement that I think is honestly very Taoist, because the Tao itself, it says, in the pursuit of learning, every day something is acquired. In the pursuit of the way, every day something is dropped. There's this sense in the Tao in which it's like, if you want to continue progressing in the way, you have to give up other things. You have to abandon things that are not the way. Every day, let's say you're learning more and more, you're learning about all these other religions, and you're like, man, I feel like there's a way for me to make all these fit. I feel like maybe perennialism's true. Maybe all religions are secretly true, and I can just kind of cherry pick what I like about certain religions. Or I can just commit to a religion that says all religions are true or something like that, right? But the Tao itself says, no, you actually do have to commit wholeheartedly to the way, and you're going to have to drop things along the way. And Christianity, obviously, is a very exclusive religion, right? It's God's a jealous God, and God is not going to allow you to have these hidden sort of idols or to be syncretic in your beliefs. You have to be. It's an exclusive relationship. It's not an open relationship, and so I think what Father Damascene is capturing it here is that you do have to commit to the way fully. Otherwise, you risk remaining outside of the bridal chamber. There's a sense in Christianity where everything's leading up to this wedding of man with God, God being united to his bride, the church. And Christ is continually using this metaphor of the wedding feast, the bridal chamber, And I think what it is it's that it is pointing to this necessity to make a choice in favor of following the way, rather than saying, oh, well, who's to say what's true? Who's to say what the way really is? Can't we just, can I have my cake and eat it too? I think it is to me, it smacks of a particularist view of truth rather than this sort of pluralist, relativist view.
Yeah. All right, I see what you're getting at here. So to go, I wanted to, so with that first line, right, allowed to, nobody, what does it say? The real Tao cannot be followed. I mean,
or that it can't be named.
Can't be named or follow.
Yeah.
Or the Tao that is followed is not the real Tao.
Yes.
So in defense of Mr. Lao Tzu, I mean, it's kind of true for his situation.
Right.
Like he did not have, again, it goes back to him being honest, right? He was not revealed. Part of the belief of revealed religious Christianity is that, I mean, Moses was a righteous man and the most humble man and all that, but ultimately God acts and reveals. himself to Moses. So it wasn't through Moses' contemplation or his excellence in philosophizing that he perceived what he perceived. It was, it's a mystery at the end of the day. It's a very hard question. I can't get to the bottom of it. But the point here is that with Lao Tzu, he's speaking within his historical context. So I don't think it's right or fair to take that and say, well, it's the 21st century and, the real Tao can't be named and it can't be followed. Well, now it can be named and followed. So that's one thing. When it comes to these distinctions, and again, I'm just filled with admiration for this man, for this sage. I certainly, if you just kind of take the context where he lived, it's amazing what he achieved. And so when it comes to this difference, right, including Tao being impersonal and so on, this reminds me of the stuff I was thinking about writing about when it came to the psychedelic transcendental, right? And this idea that these people taking psychedelic drugs and seeing visions and so on would kind of be like, wow, I'm seeing beautiful visions. This must be true, right? And I think the kind of one thing we can rationally grasp that's unique to Christianity is the idea of repentance. And related to it is sin. This is the kind of so Lao Tzu knows self-emptying and humility is the way to the Tao. But I think what's missing in that equation is how do you get to that very bottom of humility and self-emptying is by realizing that you're not God, like getting rid of the monist stuff, that we're fallen, right? That we used to be connected in some primeval state, that we need to get connected back, and it's this, like the final humility of confessing our sins and repentance in the Christian sense. That's missing across the board. Okay, and I can tie that into Girard too, right? What is the scapegoating mechanism? It's the transfer of guilt. It's the transfer of sin. So humanity in its default mode, that includes a lot of Christians, Christian cultures and Hebrew cultures. The one thing they couldn't kind of reveal to themselves is this kind of like the sinfulness or the need to repent. So with a lot of these violent sacred cultures, it was the transfer of guilt. The violence is transferred onto sacred victim. I think in the East, you get the monistic kind of stuff. It's like we're not really guilty. We're just these malfunctioning tentacles of the one God, and we need to get on the same frequency. So that's the kind of big reveal, but also that's not something people don't want to face if you're young. And when you describe your kind of vibes early on, I was in a very similar mindset. So that's one thing kind of we don't want, me and you and a lot of other people don't want. You want to look at that dark side, which is not so exotic, right? It's just kind of, it makes you contrite. It just kind of sucks the air out of your pride. We need to actually confess our sins, and realize we don't know what we're doing. So that's in some kind of basic way the big difference, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to. I think you put it so much better than even I could, to be honest. And I wanted to get. I wanted to get your thoughts on one of these passages here. So there's a passage from the Tao. It says, "Occult abilities are just flowers of the Tao and the beginning of foolishness."
What's the first word?
Occult abilities.
Okay.
Thoughts on that?
Who said? Is that Father Damascene or?
This is from the Tao itself. Yeah, this is from the Tao Te Ching.
So, occult abilities are?
Occult abilities are just flowers of the Tao and the beginning of foolishness.
Yeah, so kind of shooting off the hip here, and again trying to come in defense, because obviously it sounds negative. We have to understand here the translations, and we have to have a historical perspective here. right? So we're living. So to us, occult means anti-Christian, demonic. Maybe it was somehow demonic too in Lao Tzu's time, but I would just question, what does occult mean? I mean, he doesn't have those categories of mind where there's good religion is, good religion is not a cult, bad religion is a cult. I really doubt that was actually a dichotomy in his place. So by occult, he might have meant something like, we are talking about some kind of shamanistic religion. So you could imagine that in his time, there were these shamans, priests, who could do some occult stuff, right? So he says occult things are a flower of Tao. I still wouldn't agree that's the case, right? But maybe this one we just kind of put it under limitations of these archaic religions. But anyways, I would question, what does he mean? Like, this is where you have to talk to a scholar, right?
Right.
Like the scholar that Father Damascene might know. You have to talk to somebody in China who's who study this. Like, there's an unbroken tradition of interpretation, just like you got to interpret the Bible, right? So I would ask, what does this word occult mean? Because it can be misleading. What would occult be imagined as in 6th century BC China? And then, based on that, you could probably get a good reason for it. I wouldn't kind of jump to conclusions without interpretation of that word,
Right,
and the word flower.
I think that is a super good kind of mindset to go into any of these ancient texts, because one thing I made a mistake of whenever I was super young, most people I'm sure make this mistake. Whenever you get into philosophy, you start reading things. You see Heraclitus is talking about the logos. And in John it talks about the logos. Those must mean the exact same thing. Different writers use different words interchangeably. I think, and especially being a Westerner reading, ancient Eastern texts like this, some words, some context can just completely fly over our heads. As you were speaking, I think here's my best crack at it, because I underlined this when I was 19. I have no idea why I underlined it, and I've been sitting here trying to figure it out for the past few days, but. When I see occult abilities are just flowers of the Tao, I think about how in the Gospels you have essentially what are Christian virtues: charity, almsgiving, loving others more than yourself, all these Christian virtues. But then you also have sort of the signs and the wonders, the miracles, raising people from the dead, parting the Red Sea, all of these things that are seen as like supernatural, almost abilities. You could say both of these things, loving your neighbor and also being able to part the Red Sea and raise the dead, both of them are a result of participating in God's energies, right? It's not like man is just doing that, as a result of himself or something like that. It's drawing on the power that God has. I think in the case of occult abilities are just flowers of the Tao in the beginning of foolishness. The thing that comes to my mind is there's a quote from St. John Chrysostom where he says, I love this quote. He says, feeding the poor is greater than raising someone from the dead. Something like that, or okay. It's a greater work or something like that. I think what it maybe is speaking to, this is just my complete guess here, is this idea that, there are these things that people are dazzled by, these miracles, these strange sights, but ultimately, what is truly virtuous is these sort of humble acts of love. And it's funny too, because this is the 38th chapter. It says true virtue is not virtuous, therefore it has virtue. And then it says true virtue does not act, superficial virtue acts, and always has intentions. True. Yeah. So I think that maybe gives it a little bit.
I remember those lines. I remember those lines about kind of showy virtue, and you immediately think of the hypocrites, right?
Yeah.
The word Jesus used a lot. Okay, I missed that second part, that occult activities are beginning of foolishness. Sorry. So, like, when I was giving my first interpretation, I thought Lao Tzu put occult activities in a positive light, but he didn't. So I misheard you there. Okay.
Well,
But I guess he is maybe talking about some kind of like manifestations of spiritual powers, right?
right.
Okay.
And he to be fair, he does say flowers of the Tao. So in a certain sense, you could say that it is a virtue, but it's sort of seen as a lesser or maybe a more superficial virtue than true virtue, and it's what people mistake as true virtue, because they say, oh, this guy he can levitate or whatever.
Right. Okay. So that's around. I remember a bunch of verses around contrasting flowers and roots. So in this context, flower might be kind of like a superficiality taken for essence, kind of like bells and whistles, and he's kind of advocating grasping not the flowers which wither away, but the roots and the deep stems of virtue.
Yeah, I think I think you're spot on with that, because there's also a sense reading I think it was the I Ching many months ago. There's this sense in Chinese philosophy where there is attention paid to the difference between substance and say form or decorum or things like that. So there's a sense in which there's the flowering, which it's ornate, it's beautiful, all of these things, but it maybe lacks the substance that the root, or you could say the fruit, has. And then here's another one too. I want to get your thoughts on this. Return is the motion of the Tao. Softening is its function.
Yeah, I don't know. It's
well, so when I think of,
you tell me.
Well, I think the idea of return. I mean, we were kind of speaking of repentance earlier. I think return being the motion of the Tao, it is sort of this thing of like, if you're orienting to the Tao, you're always reorienting, and there's an ever deepening sense in which you are returning, going inward. There's an ever deepening sense of repentance. You're never fully aligned, but you can always continually ascend up and into the Tao. And then also softening as its function. I'm thinking of it from the concept of like, in the Bible, it talks about like hard-heartedness, somebody's heart being hardened. And then obviously God is who, softens people's hearts and replaces the heart of stone with the heart of flesh. So that's kind of what I was thinking. But do you have anything else? Go ahead.
I buy that. That sounds about right. Yeah. And it fits the context.
Right. Yeah. Do you have kind of anything else that you're thinking about in terms of Tao, Logos, Higher Monk Damascene?
No, I mean, I suggest you visit. I think you said you wanted to visit, but when you go to the monastery, they do have a bit of an homage to Chinese culture, and they have a garden of Gethsemane. They have a Chinese garden there, so it's got this little homage to it for sure.
Nice. Heck yeah. Well, any kind of final takeaways, I guess, for the episode in toto?
Well, it was great discussing this. I think I hope everybody listening is going to deepen some knowledge here and be motivated to explore. But it is a wonderful book. It's again, going back to the place, it's a very unique place. It's in the United States. It's in California. It's got this Orthodox vibe, like the Russian architecture. Then it's got this Chinese garden and so on. And it is just such a odd and fascinating nexus that I think it's I'm going to carry that memory for sure with me.
Nice.
So.
Heck yeah. And then, and just for me, I want to just go ahead and tell anyone in the audience, like, if you haven't read Christ the Eternal Tao, I recommend it. One thing I can say is that the first time I read this, I actually still was a Protestant. It was months before I actually, looked into Orthodoxy after this. I picked it up having no idea what Orthodoxy was. I was just hit with this. I was like, oh, this seems like a really exotic form of Christianity or whatever. That was just my first impression. Flipping through it now in preparation for our episode, I can tell you one thing. This book is super replete. Like, it has it has a lot in here. It's comparative theology. It's a good introduction to Taoism. It's an introduction to Seraphim Rose, who, you know, will if you're becoming Orthodox or something like that, he's going to be a huge on any convert's reading list, in my opinion. And I think it explicates so many Orthodox concepts that on my first read through as a Protestant totally went over my head. Didn't realize kind of the importance of a lot of these things, and just flipping through it now, I'm like kind of shocked at how much they were able to fit into this one volume. So definitely check that out, guys. George, you want to go ahead and plug any stuff that people should check out from you?
I'm still on boreassubstack.com, and I got the Boreas podcast going on your favorite podcast platform. So check it out. These are the kind of topics I like to cover. So.
Yeah, guys, George has a super, I think, very interesting insight into Girard and, you know, just different religious, you know, theories. Specifically Girard, though. I think he's definitely the go-to person when it comes to Girard. But George, thank you for joining us. Guys, thank you for watching the Park Score podcast.
Thank you for having me.